Okay, so we're going to get through the activities from day 14 here. We had a couple of complications in terms of the different types of bonds, but we started out with getting a little more practice on imputing the interest rate. So here we're just looking back at some information with an equipment that was purchased with a note, and we have the face value of the note, we have the term paid every 6 months, we have the payment that's made every 6 months, the interest payment, and we have the cash price of the machine. And item number 1, I wanted you to take a few minutes and see if you could figure out the interest rate, because it's not given in this problem. So there's a couple of ways you could do this. You could use your calculator, and I go through and give you the steps for using your calculator, which are right here in this video. So it's not real exciting because I have my hand under my camera, so I have to keep looking to see what's going on. But that's the face value. I'm going to put in as the 800,000. 6 is the number of periods. 48,000 is the amount of the payment. And then 726,034, that is the present value. So I turn that as a negative, and then I just push compute I over Y, the interest rate, and I get 8%. So that's the number that we were looking for. Okay, so you could do that with the calculator. You could also do it with the tables. So basically this goes back to what we said earlier, that you'd have to guess the rate. So I gave you a range. I said try 7 or 8 or 9%. If you tried 7%, you would have ended up with a present value bigger than 726. If you tried 9%, you would have gotten a number less than 726. That would have narrowed down your choice. If you tried 8%, you would get 726,034. Of course, you know that because we just calculated on the calculator. But really, what your calculator is doing when you hit that compute is doing this. It's going through the tables and calculating, going through the computations and picking rates until it zeroes in on the right rate. So that's what's going on there. The second part of this activity, which is a pretty quick one, was asking you what that journal entry looked like when we first bought the machine. And so when we did that, we would have debited equipment for the 726,034, and we would have credited notes payable for 800,000, and the difference would have been a discount on notes payable. This made my assets go up, this made my liabilities go down, this made my liabilities go up, for the difference, which is 74,966. So that would have been the entry to record this loan initially. And then the last question that I asked on this activity was that interest expense entry. And this should be pretty much review over what we did on in class 13. So just to remember, we took the carrying value times the rate to give us the interest expense. The cash payment is constant. Payment, oof, man, my writing's bad. Is constant. And we use those to figure out the journal entry, and any difference goes to amortize the discount. So just to finish out this activity, whoops, let me move that up out of the way. We'd have interest expense here. would be 58,083. Okay, I got that by taking 726,034 times 8%. Okay, and the cash is given in the problem that every time we make a payment, it's for 48,000. And then any difference, which has to be the credit here to make it balance, is the amortization of the discount. As that discount account gets smaller, the carrying value of the liability gets bigger. Remember, so that at maturity it equals 800,000. But along the way, it's amortizing. Basically, the difference you can see between what we're recognizing as interest expense and what the cash is paid out is the amortization piece. So that's what that entry would look like. So the interest rate you should have come up with right there, 8%. Your entry included all the following except this is just asking you about that entry that we just made. Except I might have written it wrong. I may have said 74,9966 instead of 73, but you guys do the math and fix me on that. Well, you would not have had this debit. We didn't debit the discount on that one. And the interest expense was this amount, 58,083. All right. Then we moved into a part of class we talked about complication in our just basic bond situation, and that is we're looking at convertible bonds, a convertible debenture, just another way of thinking about bonds, another term that would be used. So these bonds are convertible, and the conversion feature allows the holder to convert each $1,000 bond into 10 shares of no par common stock. The other thing we see here is that the bonds were issued. It just says at 102. Okay, so you notice when you look at this, what's missing is I didn't give you a market rate. I just told you the bonds were issued at 102. Then I also gave you some information about a recent non-convertible, so that would be like just the plain old bonds like we've talked about up to now that were issued at 99. So we spent a little bit of time real quick with your group. We talked about making sure everybody understands what 102 means. And when you talked about that with your group members, hopefully everybody remembered or came to the conclusion that the 102 is referring to how much cash was received. Okay, the cash proceeds, if you will. But it's basically 102% of face value. Okay, so likewise, this 99 tells you that when these other bonds had been issued earlier, 99% of the face value was received. So that's what the 102, it could be 102, 101, 99, 98. It's just a very common way for bond prices to be expressed. Okay, and I ask you to think about how is this bond different than the bonds we've looked at earlier. And after talking about it and reading this paragraph and thinking about it, and based on your readings, you would come to the conclusion that a key difference is the option to convert bonds to stock. So we say that makes this convertible bond have both debt and equity features. because each bond includes an option to convert the bonds to stock. Number 3, I ask you who gets to decide whether or not to convert, and in this particular bond, it's the bond holder. It's just the way the wording up above was described. The conversion feature allows the holder of the bond to convert. So that's what that was asking. And then I talk about under U.S. GAAP, we're going to record this bond just like we did at our examples the first day of the bond chapter. So I want you to think about what that would look like. Record that entry using U.S. GAAP. So here you had to think about a couple of things. We'll just go through as we do the entry. The first of which is our item 1, where we talked about what does 102 mean. This tells you how much cash we received. So this is going to be the beginning of my journal entry. I'm going to have a debit cash for 102 million. That made my assets go up. I'm going to, it's U.S. GAAP. We know we always can record the bonds payable at the face amount. Oops. And we clearly don't have a journal entry. We need 2 million more. And under U.S. GAAP, we're just going to treat this like a premium on bonds payable. So it looks very similar to entries we have done in an earlier class. My writing is really bad. All right, so that's the entry for number 4. That's U.S. GAAP. So it doesn't look any different than the entries we did earlier. Number 5, I ask you which value, I'm going to pull this down for a second, which value would be more apparent, because in IFRS, we're going to actually split the debt and equity components out. So we're going to have a value for the bonds, and we're going to have a value for that option, which is an equity option. We're going to call it a conversion option. So IFRS says you split those two things out and put a dollar amount on each one. So looking at the problem, there's not any information, there's not any information about the value of the option. There's a description of the option, but there's not really enough information to value it. There is, however, information that you could use to value the bond piece, okay? Because we know that they recently, and by here obviously I mean very recently, issued bonds that weren't convertible, and when they issued those bonds, they issued those bonds at a discount. So using that information, we can assume that the bond portion of this journal entry is going to be priced at 99. Okay, so we're looking for how we would record these bonds under IFRS. Under IFRS, so this is actually number 6 right there, we are still getting cash of 102 million. IFRS, a couple of things to note. They don't split out premiums or discounts. So we can just record the bonds payable at 99 million. Remember, the 99 million came from up above. It's based on a recent issue that they had made. And so then to make this journal entry balance, we need to come up with 3 million just to make the debits and credits balance. And this is what we're going to call our conversion option. And I'm actually going to label it PIC, which stands for paid in capital. Conversion option. Essentially that is saying my owner's equity has gone up on the balance sheet. That's a balance sheet account. Because part of the cash I received, $3 million, is paid in capital for a conversion option. Okay, part of that $102 million is the bond, the value of the bond payable, the promise that I've made to repay cash. Okay, so IFRS definitely shows you the split. I'm just going to label this as the IFRS piece and the US GAAP piece. So then we just talked about which of those entries makes most sense if you're a user of the financial statement. Obviously, that's an opinion question, so it's not something you can grade right or wrong. I think if I'm a user of the financial statement and want to know what's happened with this transaction, I think the IFRS makes it more clear to me that there are two things going on, that there's an equity option sitting out there and there's a bond. I ask you, what is the effective interest rate? This is just to give you more practice imputing the rate, but you really, I should have reworded it and said which would be higher and which would be lower. And here's what I want you to think about. The face stated rate on this bonds were 7%. And I will tell you, one of these bonds, either US GAAP or IFRS, would have an effective interest rate higher than 7%, and one would have an effective interest rate lower than 7%. And if you're trying to remember, what do I even mean by effective interest rate? I mean the market rate that you're going to have to use to calculate interest expense. It's the market rate that gives you the present value of the debt. Okay, so you need a market rate that would have resulted in $102 million present value on this bond. And in IFRS, you need an interest rate that would have given you a present value of $99 million. Well, you could think back to our classes from our class 12, or for the evening class right after the exam, and we talked about pricing those bonds, and we said whenever the bonds are issued at a discount, meaning less than the full face amount, that is an indicator that the market rate is higher than the stated rate. Likewise, we talked about when we looked at bonds that were issued at a premium, we said if a bond is issued at a premium, that's an indicator that the market rate is lower. Okay, so there I answered that question. Is it the same under IFRS? No. So when you calculate an effective rate for these two bonds, if you did that on your calculator, you would get a lower amount for the US GAAP bond than you would for the IFRS bond. So we can probably do that. Well, I'm going to leave you to do that. If you need to look back at how you calculate that, you can look back at the steps from the first activity because it's the same way using your calculator. All right. Which of the following is not one of the key differences between the bonds? Okay, so we're looking for what is not true. This is definitely true. Convertible bonds certainly allow the bondholder to trade in their bonds and get company stock rather than waiting to receive cash. So that is true. Convertible bonds allow the issuer to settle their debt without using any cash. This is true because if the bondholders do the conversion, the issuer no longer owes them any cash. The third one says convertible bonds do not require the use of the amortization tables to determine interest expense. That is not true. This is definitely not true. No, we didn't do an amortization table. We didn't go through that process with the convertible bonds, but it is definitely happening. The effective interest rate in the amortization table is continuing, even though we didn't see it in this example. In this activity 2, this quiz question is what was the conversion option worth? And here we calculate that to be the $3 million. And then which would be the closest to the rate for U.S. GAAP? Well, the stated rate was 7, and I told you the effective rate is lower. So if you do that on your calculator, you should get a number close to 6.72. It's 6.719 something, I believe. So there you go, answer too. Okay. Not exactly sure what that is about. So, okay, so now we're thinking about information from activity 2 continuing. So now we're looking at the situation where the bondholders actually exercise their option. And here, I'm assuming that half of the bondholders exercise their option to convert. And so that means half of the total $1,000 bonds were converted into stock. And at this time, I just picked this number. I just said at some point premium's going to get to $900,000. Let's just say that's when they exercised. Okay, so sometime later, they convert their bonds. So if half the bondholders exercise their option to convert, how much in face amount will disappear? Well, you remember the original face amount was $100 million. And if you think about what happens when bondholders convert, is they essentially bring back the bonds and turn them in and walk out the door with stock. So if 50% of the people exercise their option to convert, then 50% of that face amount is going to disappear. In other words, there's no longer an obligation to pay interest or cash on 50 million of those bonds because they've been turned in. Would you need to remove the premium as well? And the answer is yes, because if you think about it, that original premium we recorded, that was, you remember the bonds were issued at 102, so that means every $1,000 bond had $20 of premium. And now if that $1,000 bond with $20 of premium got turned back in, that $20 of premium would need to go away. So this is what's remaining. So we need to get rid of that as well. All right, so now we're going to look at our entry to convert the debt into equity. And it's really just going to use the information that we just had up here in item number 1. If I need to get rid of 50 million in face amount of the bonds, that's going to be a debit to bonds payable for 50 million. And I need to get rid of half of the premium. That's going to be 450,000. So what happens, the people walk in with a bond, give it to the, administrative executive, and the administrative executive turns around and gives them shares of stock. Okay, so what goes out the door is common stock is issued. So that's making our common stock account higher. And it's going to be valued at the difference. Okay, so that is the entry. Now number 4 says, did your entry include any cash? And you want to make yourself a note. No, it did not. Okay, no, it did not. There was no cash. Look at the entry. No cash. We took bonds back. So those were essentially, wrote off 50 million of the bonds. We issued stock. No longer liable for this 50 million. Now remember, it left 50 million on our books, so we still have that to repay. But these converted bonds were no longer liable. Okay. How much cash to be used to settle the debt? since the bonds were converted into equity, the company did not have to pay out any cash. That's the answer. So driving home the point. The total amount of equity that you recorded in this conversion would be the $50,450,000.